Welcome to True Life Stories Radio, where real life stories are told with genuine emotion. Today, we're stepping into a powerful story of families, secrets, and a truth no one saw coming. And this is where the story begins.
My wife of 45 years had just been lowered into the ground, and my children were already measuring our house for renovations. They inherited her $30 million empire, including the companies, the estates, the luxury apartments, and the cars. I received nothing but a dusty envelope, mocked and humiliated, told to pack my bags. By my own flesh and blood, I opened it alone that night in a cheap motel room. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an offshore bank account number and one handwritten line. "This is for the man who always loved me truly." And when I checked the balance, I realized my children had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Kenneth Wallace. I am 73 years old, and up until last week, I believed I had a family. The reception after Barbara's funeral was held at our main estate, a sprawling property in upstate New York that my wife and I had called home for 4 decades. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of white lilies and the muted murmurs of corporate acquaintances who had come to pay their respects to a business titan. But while I sat in the corner of the grand living room, numb with a grief so profound, it felt like a physical weight on my chest. My children were already dismantling her legacy. Christopher, my eldest, was standing by the fireplace with a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, laughing quietly with a group of investors. He did not look like a man who had just buried his mother. He looked like a prince who had just been handed the crown. Melissa, my daughter, was huddled in the hallway with her husband, Aaron. I watched in silent disbelief as Aaron paced the length of the home office, holding a digital laser measure against the mahogany walls, loudly discussing with a contractor over the phone about knocking down the partition to create an open-concept entertainment room. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law, Rachel, was drifting through the formal dining room like a vulture. She was picking up Barbara's antique porcelain vases, turning them over to check the maker's marks, and tapping notes into her phone. Not once did any of them approach me to ask how I was doing. Not once did they offer a comforting hand. To them, I was just a fixture of the house, as invisible as the wallpaper. They saw me as nothing more than Barbara's shadow. A simple man who spent his days pruning orchids in the greenhouse, while his brilliant wife conquered the corporate world. They whispered that I was just a glorified gardener who had gotten lucky marrying a visionary. What Christopher and Melissa did not know, what no one but Barbara knew, was the truth about our empire. 40 years ago, I sold my own highly successful logistics firm for a small fortune to save Barbara's family business from total bankruptcy. I poured every cent I had into her company, stabilizing it and setting the foundation for the $30 million behemoth it would become. I chose to step back. I let her take the spotlight as CEO because I loved seeing her shine. I did not need the applause or the titles. I only needed her. But looking at our children now, I realized that my silence had allowed them to cultivate a dangerous arrogance. 2 days later, the family gathered in the grand dining room for the official reading of the will. The estate lawyer, a cold and clinical man, sat at the head of the long oak table, shuffling his crisp papers. Christopher and Melissa sat across from me, their spouses hovering closely behind their chairs like eager spectators at a prize fight. I sat alone, my hands resting on the polished wood, still wearing the black suit from the funeral. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read the legal jargon. It did not take long to get to the core of the matter. The entire $30 million empire, the corporate operational shell, the fleet of luxury vehicles, the penthouses in the city, and the primary estate were to be divided equally, 50-50 between Christopher and Melissa. The lawyer listed off the assets one by one, and with every sentence, the smiles on my children's faces grew wider. Rachel actually let out a small squeal of delight when the city penthouses were mentioned. Then the lawyer paused, looking over his spectacles at me. To my husband, Kenneth, the will read, "I leave my deepest gratitude," and the sealed envelope currently held in the possession of this law firm. The lawyer reached into his leather briefcase and slid a worn, dusty manila envelope across the table toward me. It looked incredibly out of place among the pristine legal documents. I placed my hand over it, the rough paper feeling like a cruel joke in the silent room. Christopher let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the ice in his glass. A dusty envelope, he chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, Dad, I guess Mom knew you wouldn't know what to do with real money anyway. You always were more comfortable playing in the dirt." Melissa chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Don't worry, Dad. We are not going to leave you destitute. Christopher and I talked about it. We can offer you a $1,000 monthly allowance. You can use it to rent a nice little apartment somewhere quiet. But you will need to vacate the master suite by the end of the week. Aaron and I are planning to bring in interior decorators, and your gardening boots are ruining the carpets." I looked at the four of them. The sheer audacity, the brutal lack of empathy was staggering. $1,000 a month offered as charity in the house I had paid to build by the children I had raised. I did not yell. I did not cry. The grief I felt for my wife was suddenly eclipsed by a cold, quiet clarity. I picked up the dusty envelope, tucked it inside my coat jacket, and stood up from the table without saying a single word. I walked out of the dining room, leaving them to their hollow victory. The silent adjustment had begun. I thought I would have at least a week to process my next steps. But greed is an impatient master. Less than 48 hours after the reading of the will, I was out in the greenhouse carefully watering Barbara's prized orchids. It was the only place where I still felt close to her. The heavy glass doors slid open, and Melissa stepped inside, followed closely by Aaron. She was wearing designer clothes and stepped gingerly, clearly disgusted by the damp earth and humidity. Aaron stepped forward, holding a crisp white document. He thrust it toward me, forcing me to put down my watering can to take it. It was a legally binding 30-day eviction notice. "We changed our minds about the timeline," Melissa said, crossing her arms over her chest. "The real estate market is incredibly hot right now, and we want to flip the estate before the winter season hits. 30 days is the legal minimum, but honestly, it would be better for everyone if you were gone by the weekend. We have staging companies coming in, and having you lurking around the property is just going to complicate the aesthetic." I stared at the eviction notice. Printed words on white paper, casually erasing 40 years of my life. They were kicking their grieving father out of his own home to make a quick profit. Aaron smirked, leaning against one of the wooden workbenches. "Look at it this way, Kenneth. It is a fresh start. We will wire the first $1,000 allowance to your checking account once you hand over the keys." I looked at Melissa, searching her face for any trace of the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders and point at the stars. There was nothing there, just cold, calculating ambition. I folded the eviction notice and put it in my pocket. I did not argue. I did not beg. Arguing with fools only lowers you to their level. I walked past them out of the greenhouse and straight up to the master bedroom. I pulled an old leather suitcase from the top of the closet. I did not pack any of the expensive suits or the luxury watches Barbara had bought me over the years. I packed a few simple changes of clothes, my shaving kit, and a framed photograph of my wife. I closed the suitcase, picked it up, and walked down the grand, sweeping staircase. Christopher was standing in the foyer watching me descend. He had a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "Leaving so soon, old man," he taunted as I walked past him. "Don't forget to leave your house keys on the console." I dropped the heavy brass keys onto the marble table. The sound echoed through the massive, empty hallway. I walked out the front door and down the long, winding driveway. I could hear them laughing from the porch, cementing their belief that I was a weak, powerless old man who was simply accepting his pathetic fate. They had no idea they had just handed me the moral absolute to destroy them. By nightfall, I was sitting on the edge of a sagging bed in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The flickering neon light from the parking lot cast long, erratic shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The silence of the room was deafening, a sharp contrast to the sprawling mansion I had woken up in that morning. I placed the old leather suitcase on the floor and sat at the small, wobbly laminate desk in the corner. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the dusty manila envelope. My hands, which had remained steady when my children handed me an eviction notice, were now trembling. I broke the old wax seal and opened the flap. I slid the contents onto the desk. There was a heavy brass vault key, a small black security token, and a single sheet of heavy parchment paper. I recognized Barbara's elegant, sweeping handwriting instantly. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of tears to my eyes. The note was short. It read, "I always knew what they were becoming. I just did not want to believe. If you are reading this in a dusty envelope, it means they failed my final test. They took the shiny objects and cast you aside. But you and I built this together, Kenneth. The shell is theirs, but the soul is yours. This is for the man who always loved me truly." On the back of the paper was a string of letters and numbers, an offshore account routing code, a login portal address, and a phone number for a Mr. Reynolds. I pulled my laptop from my bag, connected to the motel's unstable internet, and typed in the secure portal address. I used the black security token to authenticate the login, my heart pounding against my ribs as the screen loaded. When the dashboard finally appeared, I had to take off my glasses and rub my eyes. I thought I was misreading the numbers. The balance on the screen was not a mere payout or a hidden retirement fund. It was the overarching parent trust. Barbara had executed a brilliant, ruthless legal maneuver before her death. She had left Christopher and Melissa the operational shell of the company. They inherited the desks, the employee contracts, the company cars, and the brand name. But they did not own the substance. According to the documents blinking on my screen, I was the sole owner of the parent holding company. I owned the patents to every single piece of intellectual property the company used. I held the real estate deeds to the massive corporate headquarters downtown, the factories and the warehouses. And sitting in the liquid asset accounts completely untouched and beyond the reach of my greedy children was $150 million. Barbara had essentially made my children my tenants. They were operating a business that was entirely dependent on leasing the patents and the buildings from a trust that they did not know existed. A trust that I now controlled entirely. They thought they had inherited a $30 million empire, but in reality they had inherited a massive liability. They had an empty operational shell, and I held all the keys to their survival. I sat back in the cheap motel chair, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the dusty room. The grief that had been paralyzing me slowly morphed into a sharp, focused determination. My children thought they had stripped me of my dignity. They thought they had tossed me into the gutter. They had mistaken my lifelong silence for stupidity and my quiet love for weakness. I looked at the photograph of Barbara on the nightstand. I promised myself right then and there that I would protect the true legacy we had built together, and I would teach Christopher and Melissa the hardest lesson of their lives. The morning sun bled through the thin curtains of the motel room, painting the faded carpet in dull shades of gray. I woke up with the stiff ache that comes from sleeping on a cheap mattress, but my mind had never been sharper. I showered in a cramped bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach and stale smoke, splashing cold water on my face to wash away the lingering shadows of grief. I was a 73-year-old widower who had just been thrown out of his own home, but I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a soldier standing at the edge of a battlefield, waiting for the fog to clear. My stomach gave a low rumble, reminding me that I had not eaten a proper meal since the morning of Barbara's funeral. I put on a simple pair of slacks and a button-down shirt, selecting the clothes of a man trying to hold on to his dignity. I walked out into the crisp morning air and headed down the street toward a small corner diner. A neon sign buzzed above the entrance, promising hot coffee and fresh eggs. Before going inside, I stepped up to the standalone cash machine bolted to the brick wall near the door. I pulled out my worn debit card linked to the joint checking account I had shared with Barbara for 40 years. It held my modest personal savings, the money I used for greenhouse supplies, groceries, and anniversary gifts. I slid the card into the machine and punched in my personal identification number. I pressed button to withdraw $60, which would be enough for breakfast and perhaps a decent lunch later. The screen processed for a moment, with a small loading circle spinning endlessly. Then a sharp beep echoed from the machine, followed by a message stating the transaction was declined and that I should contact my financial institution. I frowned while staring at the glowing screen. I thought perhaps I had pressed the wrong button since my fingers were a bit stiff from the cold morning air. I canceled the transaction, reinserted the card, and carefully typed the numbers again. This time I requested just $20. The machine beeped again, louder this time, displaying a message that the card was suspended and the account was frozen. A cold knot tightened in my chest. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed the automated customer service number for the bank. I punched in my account details and waited through the robotic prompts. When the automated voice finally read my account status, the words hit me like a physical blow. The voice stated that my accounts had been frozen by order of the estate executor pending legal review. Christopher, my eldest son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man whose college tuition I had paid in full, had frozen my personal checking accounts. He was the executor of the operational estate, and he was using that power to sever my only financial lifeline. The strategy was brutally clear. By cutting off my access to my own savings, he was starving me out. He wanted me sitting in that cheap motel room, hungry and panicked. He expected me to stare at an empty wallet and realize how small and powerless I was without him. He was waiting for my phone call. He was waiting for me to break down, dial his number, and beg for that humiliating $1,000 allowance he had dangled in front of me at the reading of the will. He wanted me to crawl back to the estate and surrender whatever dignity I had left in exchange for a few crumbs from the empire I had secretly built for them. A bitter laugh escaped my lips, disappearing into the noisy traffic of the street. Christopher had always been a skilled tactician in the boardroom, but he had never understood the hearts of the people around him. He assumed I was soft because I preferred the quiet peace of my greenhouse over the ruthless shouting matches of corporate negotiations. He did not know that 40 years ago I had ruthlessly dismantled my own competitors to build a logistics company that I eventually sold to save his mother's legacy. He had mistaken my chosen peace for an inability to wage war. When Barbara and I first met, we had nothing but ambition and a shared vision of the future. We built our lives on trust. I gave up my logistics firm because her family business was drowning in debt, and she had the brilliant mind to take it global if only she had the capital. I provided that capital. I stepped into the shadows so she could shine in the sun. Christopher and Melissa were born into a world of wealth we had forged from sheer willpower. They never saw the late nights, the terrifying margins, the sacrifices we made to ensure they would never know the cold grip of poverty. And now, because they had never struggled, they believed they were untouchable. They believed the money was their birthright simply because they shared our last name. I took my debit card and snapped the plastic in half, throwing the pieces into a nearby trash can. I did not need their scraps. I turned my back on the diner, ignoring the hunger pangs in my stomach. I walked back toward the motel with a steady and measured pace. I did not panic. I did not reach for my phone to call my son and plead for my own money. I went straight back to my room and sat down at the wobbly laminate desk. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy sheet of parchment paper Barbara had left me in the dusty envelope. I smoothed out the creases, tracing the elegant curve of her handwriting. On the back of the note, just below the offshore account routing numbers, was a name and a direct phone line belonging to Mr. Reynolds. I did not know much about Mr. Reynolds, but I knew Barbara. She never left anything to chance. If she had trusted this man with the overarching parent trust, the very soul of our family empire, then he was someone who understood discretion and power. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the number. The line rang only twice before a deep, calm voice answered, stating it was Reynolds speaking. I cleared my throat, staring at the peeling wallpaper of the motel room, and introduced myself, telling him that my name was Kenneth Wallace and that I was Barbara's husband. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Not a pause of confusion, but a silence of deep, respectful recognition. He addressed me as Mr. Wallace, shifting into a tone of absolute professional loyalty, and told me he had been waiting for my call. He expressed that he was deeply saddened to hear of Barbara's passing, adding that she was an extraordinary woman. I thanked him while keeping my voice perfectly level. I explained that she had left me a note and a key along with an offshore account that seemed to hold the parent trust for the entire corporate structure. I told him my children believed they inherited everything and that they had just frozen my personal checking accounts to force me into compliance. I heard the faint sound of a pen scratching against paper on the other end of the line. Mr. Reynolds commented on the arrogance of youth with a tone that was dry and entirely devoid of surprise. He explained that my wife anticipated they might attempt a hostile freeze of my surface assets, which was exactly why she structured the trust the way she did. He confirmed that my children were currently managing an operational shell that owed its very existence to the patents and properties I now controlled. I told him I needed to meet with him to understand the full extent of the weapon my wife left in my hands. I added that I needed to make sure my children did not see the strike coming until it was too late to evade it. Mr. Reynolds did not ask if I was sure, nor did he counsel patience or family mediation. He understood exactly what was happening. He told me he had a secure vehicle on its way to my location, and that we would meet in his private office because we had a great deal of work to do and an empire to formally claim. I hung up the phone, letting the screen fade to black in my hands. The hunger in my stomach was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, burning focus. My children wanted to see how long I could survive without them, but they were about to learn how quickly they would collapse without me. A black town car arrived outside the decaying motel exactly 15 minutes after I hung up the phone. The driver did not ask for my name or destination. He simply opened the heavy rear door and waited in silence for me to slide into the plush leather seat. As we drove away from the cracked asphalt and flickering neon lights of the city outskirts, I watched the towering glass skyscrapers rise in the distance. Those buildings represented the empire my wife and I had quietly acquired over decades of relentless work. We did not stop at the grand, gleaming high-rise that housed my children's newly inherited operational headquarters. Instead, the driver navigated the car through a narrow alleyway and pulled into a subterranean private garage beneath a much older, unassuming stone building in the heart of the financial district. Mr. Reynolds did not operate out of a flashy penthouse designed to impress tourists. He worked where real quiet power resided, in the secure, heavily fortified spaces entirely hidden from the public eye. An elevator accessed only by a key card took me directly from the garage to a private, silent floor. When the polished steel doors opened, a tall, impeccably dressed man was waiting for me in the foyer. He possessed sharp gray eyes and the calm, unwavering demeanor of a man who routinely handled billions of dollars before his morning coffee. He extended his hand, grasping mine with a firm, grounding respect that I had not felt since Barbara passed away. He introduced himself properly and guided me down a quiet hallway into a massive oak-paneled office lined with thick legal volumes and secure filing cabinets. On the center of his expansive mahogany desk sat a heavy steel lockbox. I reached into my coat pocket and handed him the heavy sheet of parchment paper, the brass vault key, and the small black security token. Mr. Reynolds inspected the items with a solemn nod, carefully placing them next to the lockbox. He looked at me with profound sincerity and stated that Barbara was the most brilliant corporate strategist he had ever had the privilege of advising. But she was also a woman who loved her husband more than anything else in this world. He explained that what my children had done to me over the past 48 hours was precisely what Barbara had feared, but it was also exactly what she had meticulously prepared for. I sank into the heavy leather chair across from his desk. the exhaustion of the past few days momentarily catching up with me. I asked him to explain in plain English exactly what power I was holding. Mr. Reynolds opened the lockbox using my brass key, extracting a thick, heavily redacted file folder. He explained that the company my children currently managed, the one they were celebrating over like lottery winners, was nothing more than a hollow operational shell. They controlled the employee payroll, the daily marketing budgets, and the fleet of leased corporate vehicles. But they did not own the soul of the business. Barbara had legally severed the intellectual property from the operational branch 5 years ago in a series of highly classified corporate maneuvers. I now held the exclusive patents to every software system, every manufacturing process, and every piece of proprietary technology the company required to generate its revenue. Furthermore, I held the ironclad deeds to all the physical real estate. The massive corporate headquarters downtown, where Christopher was currently giving orders, the regional distribution centers, and the luxury city penthouses that my daughter-in-law was already measuring for new Italian marble floors. They were all owned by my overarching parent trust. The magnitude of the revelation settled over me like a heavy blanket. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, serious timbre. He told me that my children were legally required to pay exorbitant licensing fees and monthly rent to the parent trust I now controlled. For years, Barbara had simply forgiven these debts on the back end to keep the company running smoothly. But the contracts were still legally binding and entirely active. If I decided to call in those debts today, their company would be bankrupt by the end of the month. They thought they had inherited a $30 million empire, but in reality, they had inherited a massive, suffocating liability. I was their landlord, or their licensor, and their absolute financial master. The $150 million in liquid assets sitting in the offshore accounts was simply the accumulated capital of the true empire safely locked away from their greedy hands. I asked him why she had structured it this way, why she had kept such a monumental secret even from me until after her death. Mr. Reynolds steepled his fingers, a shadow of genuine sorrow crossing his face. He reminded me of a conversation Barbara and I had shared late one night in our home office about 3 years ago. We had been reviewing the quarterly reports and noticed a series of alarming discrepancies in the company's regional expansion accounts. We had suspected that Rachel and Aaron, our children's spouses, were secretly funneling company funds into hidden offshore accounts to finance their lavish, unsustainable lifestyles. Rachel had suddenly started purchasing $250,000 sports cars, and Aaron was taking wild, unapproved risks on speculative real estate ventures, disguising the financial bleeding as aggressive market expansion. Christopher and Melissa were either too blind to see it or too arrogant to stop it. Barbara had known her health was failing long before the doctors made it official. She knew that once she was gone, Rachel and Aaron would immediately pressure Christopher and Melissa to liquidate the company, cash out the assets, and destroy the legacy we had spent 40 years building from the ground up. The dusty, unassuming envelope was Barbara's final brutal loyalty test for our children. She wanted to see if they would protect the family legacy or succumb entirely to the greed whispering in their ears. If they had treated me with the respect and love a grieving father deserved, if they had kept me in the family home and sought my guidance to navigate the transition, I would have naturally opened that envelope and brought them into the fold of the parent trust. We would have managed the wealth together. But by immediately casting me out into the street like discarded trash and freezing my meager savings to force me into submission, they proved they were exactly who Barbara feared they were. They had failed the test in the most spectacular and cruel way possible. A heavy silence fell over the oak-paneled office. The pain of my children's ultimate betrayal was still a sharp, bleeding wound in my chest, but it was now tempered by a profound, overriding sense of duty to my late wife. I looked at the lawyer and asked what our immediate countermaneuver should be. Mr. Reynolds smiled a slow, calculated, and entirely predatory smile. He said that my children were currently operating under the dangerous delusion of absolute unchecked power. They were highly likely securing massive personal loans against the corporate headquarters at this very moment, completely unaware that they did not hold the deed to the building. He strongly suggested we do not strike immediately with a full frontal assault. If we revealed my hand too soon, they might find a way to scramble and hide their personal assets. Instead, he advised that we send a quiet, routine legal notice of default for back rent to their corporate shell. It would arrive in the mail looking like standard bureaucratic paperwork. Given their current state of arrogant euphoria, they would likely ignore it entirely, assuming it was a clerical error from a forgotten vendor or a problem for their accounting department to brush aside. That arrogant oversight would be the legal snare we needed to tighten the noose around their necks. Once they ignored the formal notice, they would be in breach of contract, giving us the legal high ground to seize everything they claimed to own. I nodded in firm agreement, feeling the last traces of the helpless, grieving widower fade away. I told Mr. Reynolds to draft the default notice immediately. My children had chosen to play a game of ruthless, unforgiving greed against an old man they thought was weak. They did not realize they had just challenged the man who actually owned the board. While I sat in that quiet oak-paneled office plotting a surgical strike against their greed, my children were busy building castles on quicksand. The view from the top floor of the corporate headquarters was breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of the city skyline that Barbara and I had purchased 2 decades ago. Christopher stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a crystal glass of rare vintage champagne resting in his hand. He looked down at the bustling streets below with the supreme arrogance of a man who believed he had just conquered the world without ever having to draw a sword. He turned around to face the sprawling mahogany boardroom table where a team of eager private wealth bankers sat with their briefcases open and their pens ready. I was negotiating a $50 million personal line of credit. The collateral he offered was the very building he was standing in. The lead banker, a sharp man in a tailored suit, praised Christopher for his visionary leadership, eager to secure the business of the new generation. The banker slid a thick stack of loan agreements across the polished wood. He briefly mentioned that their compliance department would need to run a routine title verification on the real estate assets, a standard procedure for loans of this magnitude. Christopher waved his hand dismissively, his hubris entirely blinding him to the danger. He loudly proclaimed that the estate had just cleared probate and that he and his sister were the sole heirs to the Wallace empire. He grabbed a heavy gold fountain pen and signed his name with a dramatic flourish right on the line that required a strict personal guarantee. He did not know he was legally binding his own financial soul to a building he had absolutely no claim to. Across the city, Melissa and her husband Aaron were equally busy spending money they did not possess. The salty ocean breeze whipped through Melissa's hair as she stood on the teak deck of a customized 90-foot luxury yacht. It was a sleek, floating palace equipped with a private chef's kitchen and a rooftop jacuzzi. The yacht broker was giving them the grand tour, pouring expensive Prosecco and treating them like royalty. Aaron walked around with his chest puffed out, running his hands over the expensive finishes and boasting about the massive renovations they were planning for the family estate. Melissa did not even bother to negotiate the staggering $8 million price tag. She simply pulled out a newly minted corporate credit card directly linked to the operational shell's primary accounts and authorized a massive 7-figure down payment. She laughed as the transaction went through a high-pitched, careless sound that echoed across the marina. She leaned against the polished railing, sipping her Prosecco, and loudly joked to Aaron about how their father was probably sitting in a dingy diner somewhere, counting his pennies. They toasted to their brilliant future, entirely unaware that the very credit lines they were draining were about to be abruptly called in by the true master of the board. Meanwhile, Rachel, my daughter-in-law, was treating the city's most exclusive shopping district like her own personal playground. She moved from boutique to boutique, followed by eager sales associates, carrying bags filled with diamond jewelry, designer couture, and rare leather handbags. She was swiping corporate funds with a reckless abandon that bordered on mania. She believed that the seemingly endless well of company money was hers to drain, assuming that the operational shell generated pure profit without any overhead obligations. She did not understand the intricate web of licensing fees, patent royalties, and property leases that Barbara and I had meticulously structured. Rachel was financing her vanity with money that technically belonged to my parent trust. Back at the executive suite, Christopher sat behind Barbara's old desk, kicking his expensive Italian leather shoes up onto the pristine surface. His assistant walked in carrying a silver tray piled high with the day's mail. Among the glossy magazines, the invitations to charity galas, and the desperate pitches from investment firms rested a plain, unassuming white envelope. It bore no flashy logos or urgent red stamps. It was a standard routine piece of bureaucratic mail from a quiet legal firm in the financial district. It was the formal notice of default for back rent, the silent, lethal snare Mr. Reynolds had drafted just hours before. Christopher barely glanced at the stack. He was too busy planning a lavish corporate restructuring party that he intended to throw by the end of the month to formally introduce himself and Melissa as the new titans of the industry. He carelessly swept his arm across the desk, knocking the stack of mail, including the unassuming white envelope, straight into a pending tray. He told his assistant to have the accounting department deal with the boring paperwork. He ordered her to focus entirely on booking the most expensive catering service in the city for his upcoming celebration. He poured himself another glass of champagne, leaning back in the heavy leather chair, and closed his eyes in pure satisfaction. The children had surrounded themselves with fawning advisors, luxury brokers, and eager bankers. They were building an empire of debt on a foundation of absolute vapor. They were signing personal guarantees, committing corporate fraud by commingling company funds with their lavish personal expenses and illegally leveraging assets they did not own. They felt invincible. They felt untouchable. But true power does not need to boast on a yacht or brag in a boardroom. True power waits patiently in the shadows, quietly holding the master deed and waiting for the perfect moment to lock the doors. I sat across from Mr. Reynolds in his quiet mahogany office, listening to the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He slid a crisp white document across the massive desk toward me. It was a formal notice of default. It demanded immediate payment for 6 months of back rent and retroactive licensing fees for the proprietary software the operational shell relied upon every single day. The numbers were staggering, totaling over $15 million. Mr. Reynolds leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands carefully. He warned me that if we attached my name to this document right now, Christopher and Melissa would immediately hire aggressive litigators. They would file injunctions, drag the estate into probate court for years, and claim that Barbara was not of sound mind when she structured the parent trust. They would fight a war of attrition, hoping I would run out of energy or money before the truth could be fully enforced. I looked at the legal document and slowly shook my head. I told him I did not want a prolonged war in the courts. I wanted a swift, absolute victory. I instructed him to bury my name beneath the corporate veil of the holding company. The notice was to be issued by an anonymous financial entity, a faceless corporation, demanding its contractual dues. I knew my children better than anyone else in the world. If they saw my name on that paper, they would attack like cornered wolves because they believed I was weak. But if they saw a boring bureaucratic demand from a faceless corporate landlord, they would dismiss it entirely. Their arrogance would be their ultimate undoing. Across town, the quiet machinery of our trap began to turn. In the brightly lit accounting department of the operational headquarters, a senior financial controller named David sat at his desk. He was staring at the white envelope that had finally trickled down from Christopher's executive suite. David was a meticulous, loyal man who had worked closely with Barbara for 20 years. He knew the numbers inside and out. As he read the notice of default, the color drained completely from his face. He recognized the name of the holding company on the letterhead. It was the untouchable parent trust Barbara had always guarded with absolute secrecy. David immediately grabbed the document and took the elevator up to the top floor. He bypassed the receptionist and knocked urgently on the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Christopher and Melissa were inside laughing over a spread of architectural blueprints for their new executive offices. Rachel and Aaron were sitting on the plush leather sofas flipping through luxury real estate brochures planning their next lavish purchases. David stepped into the room, holding the notice like a live grenade. He interrupted their laughter, explaining that they had a critical financial emergency. He laid the notice of default on the polished boardroom table and explained that the operational shell was in violation of its core lease agreements. He told them that unless $15 million was wired to the holding company within 72 hours, the operational shell would lose access to the building and all proprietary patents. Christopher picked up the paper and skimmed it with a look of profound annoyance. He scoffed, rolling his eyes at the senior accountant. He told David that he was being ridiculously dramatic. Christopher insisted that the holding company was just a relic of his mother's outdated corporate structure, an old tax loophole she had set up decades ago. He argued that since he and Melissa now owned the company, they essentially owned the holding firm as well. Paying $15 million to themselves was just moving money from the left pocket to the right pocket, and he refused to waste liquid capital on meaningless administrative gymnastics while they were trying to secure major lines of personal credit. Melissa leaned over and glanced at the document, flicking her perfectly manicured fingernails against the heavy paper. She agreed completely with her brother. She told David that this was exactly why they needed a younger, more aggressive accounting team. She accused him of living in the past and told him to simply throw the notice in the shredder. Aaron chimed in from the sofa, laughing loudly, as he suggested it was probably just a phishing scam or a glitch in the automated billing software. David tried one last time to warn them. He pleaded with Christopher, explaining that the holding company was a completely separate legal entity and that ignoring a formal default notice could trigger catastrophic asset seizures. Christopher stood up, leaning over the table with a cold, threatening glare. He told the senior accountant that the next time he interrupted a board meeting over a clerical error, he would be packing his desk. Christopher grabbed the notice of default, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the stainless steel wastebasket in the corner of the room. Back in the secure subterranean office, I received a text message from a trusted source inside the building. It was David. He had always been fiercely loyal to Barbara, and when I had discreetly reached out to him the night before, he had agreed to keep me informed. The message was short and devastatingly clear. It simply read that the notice was presented and deliberately ignored. The trap had officially snapped shut. Mr. Reynolds poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, pushing one across the desk toward me. He raised his glass in a silent toast. By legally dismissing the notice of default, my children had waived their right to a standard legal grace period. They had officially defaulted on their core operational contracts. The banks and lenders providing them with millions in personal credit were entirely unaware that the collateral supporting those loans was now legally compromised. My children were driving at 100 miles an hour toward a cliff, and they had just proudly cut their own brake lines. The legal snare was perfectly set, and the countdown to their absolute ruin had officially begun. 3 days after the crumpled notice landed in the wastebasket, the financial guillotine finally dropped. Christopher was sitting in a luxury car dealership, running his hands over the steering wheel of a sports car that cost more than a family home. He was waiting for the dealership manager to bring out the final leasing paperwork. Instead, his phone buzzed with an urgent call from his lead private wealth banker. Christopher answered with his usual arrogant drawl, expecting an update on his $50 million line of credit. The voice on the other end of the line was completely devoid of the warm, fawning tone the banker had used just a week prior. The banker informed Christopher that their compliance department had completed a rigorous title verification on the corporate headquarters. They had discovered that the operational shell did not hold the deed to the building. Furthermore, they had uncovered that all the intellectual property, the software, and the manufacturing patents were exclusively owned by an external parent trust. The bank had immediately frozen all pending loans. Christopher felt the blood drain from his face as the banker coldly stated that the operational shell was essentially a tenant with no collateral to leverage. Christopher tried to argue with the banker, demanding to speak to a senior vice president. He insisted that the estate lawyer had explicitly read the will in their favor and that he was the rightful owner of the corporate empire. The banker remained completely unmoved. He explained that a will only transfers assets that the deceased personally owned at the time of death, and Barbara had transferred the deeds and patents into a blind parent trust 5 years ago. The operational shell possessed absolutely nothing of value except office furniture and leased company vehicles. The banker bluntly advised Christopher to secure proper legal counsel before hanging up the phone. Christopher stood in the middle of the luxury car dealership, feeling his vision blur. The wealthy facade he had projected to the world was evaporating right before his eyes. He dropped the keys to the sports car on a display desk and walked out into the cold street, his mind racing to comprehend how his mother could have orchestrated such a flawless financial block. The panic spread like a virus. Across town, Melissa was sitting in a high-end furniture showroom, selecting imported marble for her new penthouse. When she handed her shiny corporate card to the sales associate, it was swiftly returned with a polite apology. The transaction was declined. Furious Melissa pulled out 3 different personal credit cards, assuming it was a simple banking error. Every single card was denied. Her phone began to chime relentlessly with automated text messages from various financial institutions. Her yacht broker left a panicked voicemail stating that the massive 7-figure down payment had completely bounced. The bank had locked down all corporate accounts tied to the operational shell to mitigate their risk exposure. The endless river of money had suddenly run completely dry. Melissa felt a crushing weight of reality. She stood in the middle of the crowded luxury showroom, arguing with the polite but firm sales associate. She loudly threatened to take her business elsewhere, completely oblivious to the fact that her purchasing power had vanished. When she stepped outside and listened to the panicked voicemail from her yacht broker, the gravity of the situation finally settled in her chest. She owed millions of dollars on personal contracts, and the corporate safety net she relied upon had vanished. She called Aaron in a blind panic, demanding he find a solution. Aaron tried to calm her down, but his voice wavered with an underlying fear. He knew that the massive personal loans he had taken out for his speculative real estate ventures were directly tied to the corporate accounts. Without that money flowing freely, they were both looking at total personal bankruptcy. Within the hour, the 4 of them rushed back to the corporate headquarters. The atmosphere in the boardroom was no longer one of triumphant celebration. It was thick with absolute terror. Christopher paced the length of the room, his face pale and sweating. He shouted that the banks were demanding immediate proof of asset ownership and that their personal lines of credit were completely locked. Melissa sat at the polished table trembling as she stared at the alerts on her phone. She cried that the yacht broker was threatening to sue them for breach of contract. Rachel and Aaron sat on the leather sofas looking like cornered animals. They had built their entire lives on the assumption that the company vault was bottomless. Now they were facing immediate catastrophic default on their lavish personal debts. Aaron stood up and locked the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, ensuring no one from the accounting department could hear them. He walked over to the table, leaning in close to Christopher and Melissa. Aaron stated that they needed liquid cash by the end of the day, or their entire lifestyle would collapse. He reminded them that the banks were only freezing the credit lines, but the operational shell still possessed physical assets. Aaron suggested a desperate and highly illegal maneuver. He proposed they quietly sell off a fleet of corporate transport vehicles and liquidate a batch of high-value server equipment to a private overseas buyer he knew. He explained they could route the cash directly into their personal offshore accounts to bypass the corporate freeze and cover their immediate personal debts. Christopher hesitated for a fraction of a second. He knew that selling corporate assets to cover personal liabilities was blatant embezzlement. He knew it was a direct violation of fiduciary duty and an act of severe corporate fraud. But Rachel quickly chimed in, manipulating his fear. She told Christopher that if he did not secure the cash immediately, the banks would publicly ruin his reputation, and he would become a laughingstock in the financial district. She played on his arrogance, reminding him that he was the boss, and that he could easily forge the accounting records later to make the missing assets look like a standard depreciation write-off. Melissa wiped her tears and eagerly agreed with Rachel, stating they had no other choice, driven by blind panic and a desperate need to maintain his facade of wealth. Christopher finally. He pulled out his laptop and began authorizing the rapid liquidation of the company fleet and tech servers. He bypassed the standard corporate protocols, routing the approvals directly to Aaron and his shadow buyer. They thought they were being incredibly clever and resourceful. They believed they were solving their liquidity crisis with a brilliant behind-the-scenes maneuver. They had absolutely no idea that every single digital authorization they processed was automatically copied to the overarching parent trust. Sitting in my quiet hotel suite, I watched the alerts pop up on my secure portal. My children were actively documenting their own corporate treason. They were no longer just arrogant heirs mismanaging a business. They had officially crossed the line into criminal fraud, handing me the exact weapon I needed to strip them of everything they claimed to own. I dressed in the clothes they expected to see. I bypassed the fine wool suits Barbara had purchased for me in Milan and reached into the back of the closet at my hotel. I pulled out my old faded corduroy trousers, a frayed flannel shirt, and the scuffed leather boots I used for working in the greenhouse. I needed to look like the defeated, helpless old man they believed me to be. I needed them to feel absolutely superior so their true nature would flow out without any filter. I placed my phone in my breast pocket, making sure the microphone was unobstructed, and took a taxi to the downtown financial district. The corporate headquarters was a monument to modern wealth. Towering panels of reflective glass stretched up into the clouds. I walked through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the sprawling lobby. The floors were cut from pristine white marble, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and freshly brewed espresso. Men and women in tailored business attire rushed past me, their eyes sliding right over my worn clothes, as if I were merely a smudge on the pristine walls. I walked slowly toward the main reception desk, letting my shoulders slump and my steps drag. I was playing the part of a broken man begging for scraps. The receptionist, a young woman with a sleek headset and a look of practiced disdain, glanced up as I approached. Before she could even ask for my business, the private executive elevator chimed across the lobby. The polished doors slid open, and Christopher marched out. He was accompanied by two nervous-looking vice presidents, but his face was tight with barely concealed panic. The banks freezing his credit lines had clearly taken a toll on his nerves. He was holding a stack of files tightly against his chest, barking orders at his subordinates. Then he turned his head and saw me standing by the reception desk. He stopped dead in his tracks. The panic on his face instantly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He handed the files to one of the vice presidents and marched across the marble floor toward me. I slipped my hand into my breast pocket and discreetly pressed the record button on my phone. The trap was set. "What are you doing here?" Christopher hissed, his voice low and trembling with anger. "You are embarrassing me. Get out." I kept my head bowed and let my voice waver, perfectly faking the tremor of a desperate old man. I told him that my debit card was declined at the diner. I told him that I had no money for food and that the bank said my accounts were frozen. I looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes and asked him for the $1,000 allowance he and Melissa had promised me at the reading of the will. I begged him to just give me enough to survive the week. Christopher stared at me for a long moment. Then he threw his head back and let out a loud, cruel laugh. The sound echoed off the high ceiling of the lobby, causing several employees and executives to stop and turn their heads. Christopher did not lower his voice. In fact, he spoke louder, leaning into the public spectacle. He wanted an audience. He wanted everyone to see how powerful he was while he was secretly drowning in debt behind closed doors. On allowance, he mocked, his voice ringing across the marble floor. "You come into my building dressed like a vagrant and demand a handout. Did you really think we were going to pay you $1,000 a month just for existing? That was a joke, old man. A polite way to get you to pack your bags and leave our property without a fight. You do not get a pension for planting flowers and riding my mother's coattails." I kept my hands trembling at my sides. I softly asked him how I was supposed to live. I reminded him that I was his father, that I had raised him, and that Barbara would be devastated to see him treating me this way. The mention of his mother pushed him entirely over the edge. He stepped closer to me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. He announced to the watching crowd that I was nothing but a glorified gardener. He stated that I had contributed absolutely nothing to the $30 million empire he now controlled. He told me that his mother left me a dusty envelope because that was exactly what my life amounted to, nothing but dirt and empty paper. He told me to go find a job digging ditches if I wanted to eat, because the Bank of Barbara was officially closed. I looked around the lobby. Dozens of people were watching, whispering to one another. I had given him every opportunity to show a single ounce of compassion or basic human decency. Instead, he chose to humiliate an old man in front of his entire staff to inflate his own fragile ego. The recording on my phone was capturing every single word, every cruel insult, every admission of his complete moral bankruptcy. Christopher turned toward the heavy mahogany security desk near the entrance. He snapped his fingers, loudly commanding the attention of the 2 towering security guards posted there. He pointed at me with a look of absolute disgust. He ordered the guards to remove the vagrant from his lobby immediately. He explicitly instructed them to throw me out onto the street and to permanently ban me from ever setting foot on company property again. The guards walked over their faces, tight with professional discomfort, but they followed the orders of the man they believed owned the building. They placed their heavy hands on my arms. I did not resist. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene. I simply let my shoulders drop further and allowed them to escort me across the long lobby and out through the glass doors. I was pushed out onto the cold concrete sidewalk as the morning commuters rushed past. I stood on the curb and pulled my phone from my breast pocket. I pressed the button to stop the recording and saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. I pulled a pair of wireless earphones from my pocket and played the file back. Christopher's cruel, mocking voice played clearly in my ears, calling me a glorified gardener and threatening me with starvation. I listened to the recording twice. Any lingering shadows of paternal guilt, any tiny fragile hope that my son was simply misguided, entirely vanished in the cold morning wind. The man inside that building was not my child. He was a parasite feeding on a legacy he did not earn. My heart stopped bleeding for him and instead filled with a calm, absolute moral clarity. He had publicly thrown me out of the building that I secretly owned. He had provided me with the ultimate justification to drop the hammer without a single shred of mercy. I turned my back on the glass tower, hailed a passing taxi, and headed straight back to my lawyer. It was time to burn their fake empire to the ground. The walls of the executive suite were rapidly closing in on Christopher and Melissa. The sprawling corporate headquarters, which had felt like a magnificent palace only a week ago, now felt like a very expensive and suffocating prison. The heavy mahogany phones on their desks had stopped ringing with congratulatory calls from eager investors and were now incessantly buzzing with aggressive demands from creditors. The hasty fleet liquidation Aaron had orchestrated the day before was merely a drop in the bucket compared to the massive personal loans they had taken out to fund their lavish lifestyles. Rachel was pacing the floor of the boardroom in tears, complaining bitterly that her favorite luxury boutique had declined her card right in front of her wealthiest friends. Aaron was frantically refreshing the banking applications on his phone, watching his various accounts freeze one by one as the financial institutions locked down their assets. Christopher sat behind his heavy oak desk, rubbing his temples in a desperate attempt to ward off a blinding headache. He had reached out to every legitimate buyer in the city to quietly offload the main building, but word had already spread through the financial district that the siblings were entirely toxic. Legitimate banks and corporate buyers wanted months of rigorous due diligence and extensive title searches. They did not have months. They barely had 48 hours before their catastrophic default became public news, and the financial authorities started asking very uncomfortable questions about the missing company funds. Then his phone buzzed with an encrypted message. It was a response from a shadow broker Aaron had contacted the night before in a moment of pure panic. An overseas investment syndicate was willing to buy the corporate headquarters in cash within 24 hours. There would be no lengthy audits and no public announcements. It was a discreet and immediate lifeline. Christopher did not know that the syndicate was a dummy corporation, completely controlled by Mr. Reynolds and quietly funded by my overarching parent trust. The address provided by the shadow broker led them to an unmarked gray stone building on the far industrial edge of the financial district. The sky above was overcast, matching the bleak and desperate mood of the 4 passengers in the luxury town car. There were no corporate logos, smiling receptionists, or marble water fountains greeting them at the entrance. A silent, towering security guard escorted Christopher, Melissa, Rachel, and Aaron down a narrow concrete hallway and into a sterile, windowless conference room in the basement. The room smelled faintly of cold, recycled air and harsh chemical polish. A long stainless steel table dominated the gloomy space. Sitting at the far end of the table was a man introduced only as Mr. Reed. He wore a severe dark suit and possessed pale eyes that looked entirely devoid of human empathy or warmth. He was one of Mr. Reynolds' most ruthless junior partners, explicitly chosen for his unique ability to intimidate desperate and arrogant people without ever raising his voice. Christopher tried to maintain his usual posture of arrogant superiority as he entered the room. He puffed out his chest and threw his expensive leather briefcase onto the metal table, loudly declaring that the building was a prime piece of real estate and that they were doing the syndicate a massive favor by offering it off the market. Mr. Reed did not blink. He did not offer them water or engage in any polite pleasantries. He simply folded his hands on the table and stated that the syndicate was fully aware of their catastrophic liquidity crisis and their urgent need for untraceable cash. He calmly and methodically laid out the terms of the acquisition. The syndicate would purchase the corporate headquarters for 30 cents on the dollar. The cash would be wired directly to their personal offshore accounts within 24 hours, ensuring their private debts could be silenced immediately and their luxury assets saved from repossession. Melissa gasped loudly at the deliberately insulting lowball offer, slamming her hands down on the cold table. She shouted that 30 cents on the dollar was an absolute robbery and that the building was worth tens of millions more on the open market. Mr. Reed looked at her with a chilling, deadpan expression and gently suggested she try selling it to a traditional bank if she felt she had the time. He reminded her that a traditional bank would require a full title verification, which would take a minimum of 60 days, a luxury he knew they did not possess. The mere mention of a thorough title verification made the blood drain completely from Christopher's face. He knew that if any legitimate financial institution looked too closely, they would discover that the parent trust actually owned the deeds to the property. Rachel grabbed Christopher's arm, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered panic. She begged him to take the deal right then and there. She reminded him that if their creditors went public, they would lose their luxury apartments, their imported cars, and their social standing in the city. Aaron echoed her desperate sentiments, sweating profusely, as he told Christopher that securing 30% of a fortune was vastly superior to suffering 100% of a humiliating bankruptcy. The pressure of their own blinding greed was suffocating them in that windowless room. Christopher looked over at his sister. Melissa bit her lip, her previous bravado completely crumbling under the terrifying reality of their immediate financial ruin. She gave a small defeated nod, indicating that they had to take the cash. Mr. Reed slowly pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and slid them across the cold metal table. He handed Christopher a heavy black pen. Mr. Reed explained in a smooth, steady, monotone voice that, because this was a highly irregular expedited cash transfer, the syndicate required complete and absolute legal indemnity. He casually mentioned that the addendums in the contract contained standard liability waivers to protect the buyers from any future corporate fallout. He told them the documents explicitly stated that the sellers were authorizing the sale to cover emergency personal liabilities and that they fully acknowledged they were bypassing standard corporate board approvals to execute the rapid transfer. Christopher hesitated for a brief fleeting second, his pen hovering nervously over the signature line. A small rational voice in the back of his mind likely warned him that he should absolutely have his own legal team review the dense paperwork before signing away a massive corporate asset. But he was blinded by sheer panic and the seductive promise of immediate financial salvation. He did not want to involve his own lawyers, because his lawyers would inevitably ask why he was selling the primary corporate headquarters simply to pay off Rachel's maximum credit cards and Aaron's catastrophic real estate bets. He simply wanted the money to make the nightmare go away and secure his false status. What Christopher and Melissa did not read in the dense legal jargon was the fatal poison pill Mr. Reynolds had meticulously crafted and hidden within the text. The documents did not just waive their rights to sue the new buyer. The documents contained specific, carefully worded clauses where the signatories admitted to commingling corporate funds with their own personal accounts. The addendum explicitly and legally acknowledged the existence and the superior claim of my parent trust over the operational shell they managed. By signing those papers, they were officially confessing under penalty of perjury to gross financial mismanagement, corporate embezzlement, and attempted fraud. They were literally signing their own arrest warrants and handing them directly over to their landlord. Christopher pressed the pen to the heavy paper and signed his name with a frantic, messy scrawl. He pushed the thick contract toward Melissa. She did not even bother to pretend to read the terms. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the heavy pen, but she quickly signed her name right below her brother's signature. Aaron and Rachel let out massive sighs of relief, sinking back into their metal chairs, truly believing they had just dodged a massive financial bullet. They foolishly believed they had outsmarted the system and secured the exact amount of cash they needed to maintain their fake empire for a few more years. Mr. Reed calmly gathered the documents, tapping them neatly against the table to align the edges. He did not smile or offer a handshake. He placed the signed confessions safely back into his briefcase and stood up. He informed them that the funds would be processed exactly according to the terms of the agreement and walked out of the room, leaving them to celebrate their hollow and destructive victory. Back in my secure hotel suite, I stood by the window looking out over the city skyline as the evening rolled in. My phone softly chimed from the coffee table with a simple encrypted text message from Mr. Reynolds. The message read that the assets were fully secured and the confessions were permanently signed in ink. My children had just attempted to sell me a building I already owned using the very money I provided, and in the process they had handed me the absolute undeniable legal proof of their criminal activities. The trap was now perfectly complete, and the final execution of their downfall was ready to begin. The morning after the frantic signing in that dark basement, my children arrived at the corporate headquarters with the swagger of victorious kings. Christopher strutted through the marble lobby wearing a brand new bespoke suit, acting as if the agonizing panic of the previous day had never happened. Melissa walked right behind him, holding an expensive iced coffee, loudly discussing her plans to hire a fresh interior design team for her penthouse. They truly believed they had outsmarted the system. They were entirely convinced that the shadowy investment syndicate would wire millions into their personal offshore accounts by sunset, quietly erasing their catastrophic debts and allowing them to maintain their lavish illusion of total supremacy. They rode the private executive elevator up to the top floor, stepping out into the plush reception area. But the atmosphere was not celebratory. The usual hum of ringing phones and clacking keyboards had been replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Standing in the center of the reception area was a team of 10 sharply dressed men and women holding heavy locked briefcases. They did not look like eager partners or friendly vendors. They possessed the cold, calculating posture of forensic accountants. Christopher paused, his arrogant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered, puffing out his chest and demanding to know who had authorized a massive, unannounced delegation onto his executive floor. The lead auditor, a stern woman with piercing eyes, stepped forward. She did not offer a polite handshake or a deferential greeting. She simply handed Christopher a thick, legally binding mandate. She announced in a loud, clear voice that her firm had been formally retained to conduct an immediate, comprehensive emergency audit of all corporate operations, financial ledgers, and physical assets. Melissa dropped her iced coffee onto the pristine carpet, the plastic cup cracking and spilling cold brown liquid across the expensive fibers. She stared at the auditors in sheer terror. Christopher snatched the mandate, scanning the dense legal jargon with frantic eyes. His mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion that made sense to him. He assumed the federal tax authorities had flagged the sudden erratic movement of corporate funds and the hasty liquidation of the company fleet. He believed this was a random, aggressive government check. He had absolutely no idea that Mr. Reynolds had personally dispatched this elite team of private forensic auditors on behalf of my overarching parent trust to legally secure the premises before the final confrontation. Christopher tried to stall them, deploying his usual aggressive charm. He loudly stated that they were in the middle of a massive corporate restructuring and that his accounting team would gladly send over the requested digital files by the end of the month. The lead auditor completely ignored his blustering demands. She signaled to her team, and the 10 accountants immediately fanned out across the floor, walking past the stunned assistants and marching directly into the financial control rooms. She coldly informed Christopher that they were not there to request files. They were there to seize all local servers, freeze the operational ledgers, and physically impound every single paper record on the premises. Absolute sheer panic finally shattered Christopher's confident facade. He grabbed Melissa by the arm and dragged her down the hall into the main executive suite, slamming the heavy mahogany doors shut behind them and twisting the brass lock. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed Aaron and Rachel, demanding they get up to the office immediately. The four of them were now trapped in the very suite they had celebrated inheriting just a few weeks prior. Aaron paced the floor, pulling at his hair, muttering that they were completely finished. He knew that if any competent auditor looked at the ledgers, they would instantly see that the operational shell was bleeding cash to cover Rachel's exorbitant shopping sprees and his own disastrous real estate gambles. Melissa was hyperventilating, leaning against the large glass window, crying that the authorities were going to seize her luxury cars and throw them all in federal prison for tax evasion and corporate embezzlement. Christopher stared at the massive filing cabinets lining the back wall of the executive suite. Those cabinets held the raw, unredacted paper trails of their personal expenses disguised as corporate write-offs. He made a desperate and highly illegal decision. He ran to the corner of the room and turned on the heavy-duty industrial cross-cut shredder. The machine whirred to life with a loud, hungry hum. He ordered Aaron to start pulling out the files from the cabinets. For the next hour, the four of them engaged in a frantic, pathetic display of criminal destruction. Rachel and Melissa tore through the folders, ripping out expense reports, private luxury receipts, and the hastily printed invoices from the illegal fleet liquidation they had authorized just 24 hours ago. They fed the thick stacks of paper into the shredder, the machine grinding and chewing the documents into tiny, irrecoverable strips of confetti. They were sweating their designer clothes, wrinkling, as they desperately tried to erase the physical evidence of their blinding greed. They thought they were saving themselves by destroying the paper trail. What they did not realize was that their frantic shredding was entirely useless. In the modern corporate world, every single paper receipt is automatically backed up to secure off-site digital cloud servers. The forensic auditors down the hall were already extracting pristine digital copies of every single crime my children were currently trying to physically destroy. By shredding the documents, Christopher and Melissa were not hiding their tracks. They were actively committing the felony of destroying corporate evidence during an active investigation, handing my legal team the final nail needed for their coffin. Sitting safely in my hotel room, I listened to the steady updates from Mr. Reynolds. He informed me that the auditors had successfully locked down the accounting department and that security cameras in the executive hallway showed the siblings had barricaded themselves inside the main suite. The hum of the shredder could be heard through the heavy wooden doors. A profound sense of calm settled over me. My children were inside that room, destroying their own futures, strip by strip. They had taken the bait, swallowed the hook, and were now actively building the very cage that would lock them away. The stage was perfectly set for the final act. The morning sun reflected off the towering glass walls of the corporate headquarters, casting long, sharp shadows across the city. Inside the executive suite, the atmosphere had shifted from frantic terror to a manic, toxic delusion. After spending hours destroying physical documents, Christopher and Melissa had convinced themselves they had successfully erased all evidence of their financial crimes. In their arrogant minds, the lack of paper meant a complete lack of proof. They believed they were untouchable once again. Driven by a desperate need to reclaim control, Christopher decided that playing defense was for the weak. He was going to play offense. He was going to assert his absolute dominance over the company and publicly crush anyone who dared to question his authority. Christopher ordered his assistant to summon every remaining member of the board of directors for an emergency meeting at noon. These were not the seasoned, loyal advisors who had helped Barbara build the empire. Those veterans had been systematically pushed out and replaced by Christopher over the past few weeks. The current board consisted entirely of his hand-picked friends, wealthy socialites, and eager sycophants who relied on him for their prestigious titles and lucrative stipends. He knew they would not ask difficult questions. He knew they would simply rubber stamp whatever demands he placed in front of them. Melissa took charge of controlling the public narrative. She spent the morning calling the most prominent financial journalists in the city, inviting them to the grand lobby of the corporate headquarters for an exclusive press conference. She promised them a major announcement regarding a massive corporate restructuring and the dawn of a bold new era for the Wallace Empire. She intended to spin the aggressive presence of the forensic auditors as a proactive measure initiated by her and Christopher to clean up the outdated accounting practices left behind by their mother. It was a staggering display of pathological deceit. They were literally planning to smile for the cameras and take public credit for the very investigation that was currently uncovering their massive embezzlement. As the clock struck 12, Christopher and Melissa marched out of the executive suite and down the hall toward the grand boardroom. Aaron and Rachel followed closely behind them, walking with their heads held high, trying to project an image of untouchable wealth. Christopher wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, his hair slicked back, and his jaw set in a hard, confident line. Melissa wore a pristine white designer dress, adorned with heavy gold jewelry, attempting to look like the absolute picture of corporate royalty. They walked past the rooms where the forensic auditors were quietly working, entirely ignoring the cold reality operating just a few feet away. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand boardroom swung open. The long, polished table was surrounded by the hand-picked board members, all murmuring nervously among themselves. Outside the thick glass walls of the boardroom, the invited journalists were already gathering in the adjoining lobby, setting up their cameras and holding their notepads. They were watching the powerful heirs take their seats, expecting a masterclass in modern corporate leadership. Christopher walked to the head of the table. He did not sit down. He stood tall, resting his hands firmly on the polished wood, and looked around the room with a gaze of absolute supreme authority. He spoke in a loud, commanding voice, ensuring that his words carried a tone of absolute finality. He announced that the company was entering a necessary and aggressive phase of modernization. He explicitly stated that the team of auditors currently occupying the building were rogue contractors who had overstepped their boundaries and caused unnecessary panic. With a dramatic wave of his hand, he officially declared that the auditing firm was terminated immediately, effectively trying to fire the very people who were building the criminal case against him. The board members nodded eagerly, completely ignorant of the true legal disaster unfolding around them. They murmured their agreement, praising Christopher for his decisive and bold leadership. Encouraged by their blind loyalty, Christopher moved to the second phase of his desperate plan. He signaled to Aaron, who proudly opened his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal contracts. Aaron distributed these documents around the table, placing a copy in front of each board member. Christopher explained that because the company was undergoing such a massive and highly publicized restructuring, it was standard corporate procedure to secure the executive transition. He told the board that these documents were simply routine retention packages designed to stabilize the leadership team during the transition period. In reality, the documents were massive ironclad golden parachutes. Christopher and Melissa were demanding that the board legally guarantee them an exit package of $20 million each, payable immediately, in the highly unlikely event that their positions were somehow terminated. They were trying to bleed the last drops of capital from the operational shell, attempting to guarantee their personal wealth, regardless of what happened to the business. Melissa leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and smiled warmly at the board members. She used her sweetest, most persuasive voice, claiming that the Shadow Investment Syndicate had already wired the preliminary funds to secure their new ventures. She lied effortlessly, stating that the company had never been more liquid, and that these golden parachutes were merely a formality to appease their personal wealth managers. She assured them that signing the documents was the final step required to launch their glorious new chapter. Rachel nodded enthusiastically from the sidelines, silently cheering on the brazen theft. Aaron and Rachel were not just passive observers. They were actively managing the journalists outside the glass doors, passing out glossy press folders filled with fabricated financial projections. Rachel smiled brightly at the cameras, whispering to the reporters that Christopher was stepping into his destiny. They were entirely complicit in the massive fraud, eagerly anticipating the moment the golden parachute funds would hit their personal accounts. The greed was a palpable living thing in the room, consuming all of them entirely. The board members flipped through the thick contracts. A few of them looked slightly confused by the staggering numbers and the immediate payout clauses, but they were too intimidated by Christopher's aggressive posture to raise any formal objections. The flashing lights of the journalists' cameras clicking through the glass walls added an immense pressure to the room. The board members wanted to be part of the winning team. They wanted to remain in the good graces of the wealthy, powerful heirs. Christopher picked up a heavy gold pen from the center of the table and held it out. His voice grew louder, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He demanded that they sign the resolutions immediately, stating that he would not tolerate any hesitation or disloyalty on a day of such historic victory. He declared himself the absolute master of the Wallace Empire, announcing that the future belonged entirely to him and his sister. He stood at the head of the table, blinded by his own towering hubris, believing he had successfully outmaneuvered the banks, the auditors, and the ghost of his own mother. The first board member, a wealthy real estate developer, placed his pen on the thick paper. The sound of the ink scratching against the contract seemed to echo loudly in the tense silence of the room. One by one, the other members followed suit, signing away tens of millions of dollars that the operational shell simply did not possess. Christopher watched the signatures accumulate with a hungry, predatory satisfaction. He felt a rush of pure adrenaline, convinced that he had just legally insulated himself from any future financial collapse. The board members reached for their pens. The journalists outside pressed closer to the glass, eager to report on the aggressive restructuring of the famous logistics empire. Christopher and Melissa shared a triumphant, glowing smile, truly believing they had secured their tens of millions and successfully buried all their crimes under a mountain of fake corporate authority. They felt completely invincible. They felt entirely untouchable. They had absolutely no idea that their spectacular public performance was merely the opening act for their absolute ruin, and that the true master of the empire was already walking down the hallway. The heavy gold pen in the hands of the first board member was mere millimeters from the signature line. The air in the grand boardroom was thick with the intoxicating scent of unearned wealth and blind arrogance. Christopher stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, practically vibrating with triumph, as he watched his hand-picked sycophants prepare to sign away tens of millions of dollars. Outside the thick glass walls, the invited journalists were eagerly snapping photographs, capturing what they believed was the glorious coronation of the new corporate king. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control system and the self-satisfied breathing of the heirs. Then, the massive double doors of the grand boardroom did not simply open. They were pushed apart with a slow, deliberate, and absolute authority that sent a shockwave of cold air sweeping through the stagnant room. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance, expecting to see the breathless catering staff, or perhaps the shadow investors, arriving to finalize their discreet buyout. Instead, a collective gasp rippled around the long table. The man standing in the threshold was not a waiter, and he was certainly not a nameless overseas broker. It was me. I did not look like the broken, grieving widower they had cruelly evicted from the family estate. I was no longer wearing the faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots of a discarded gardener begging for scraps in the lobby. I was dressed in a flawless charcoal gray bespoke suit that Barbara had commissioned for me from a master tailor in Milan 5 years ago. The fabric draped perfectly over my shoulders, projecting an aura of quiet, unassailable power. My posture was completely transformed. My back was straight, my head was held high, and my eyes were locked directly onto my son, with the cold, predatory focus of a true corporate titan reclaiming his throne. I did not walk into that room alone. Flanking me on my right was Mr. Reynolds, projecting the terrifying calm of a legal executioner. He carried no flashy briefcase, just a thick, heavy stack of crimson folders resting casually under his arm. On left stood the lead forensic auditor, her piercing eyes scanning the panicked faces of the board members, accompanied by 2 of her senior investigators. We stepped onto the thick carpet, moving as a single united front of absolute financial devastation. For a long, terrible moment, Christopher simply stared at me. The smug, triumphant smile melted off his face, replaced by a sudden erratic twitch in his jaw. His mind was violently struggling to process the impossible image before him. He had convinced himself that I was a pathetic, helpless old man crying in a cheap motel room. Seeing me standing there flanked by the city's most feared corporate attorney and the very auditors he thought he had just fired shattered his fragile reality into 1,000 jagged pieces. Melissa let out a sharp, strangled breath, taking a physical step backward until her designer heels hit the edge of the leather sofa. Rachel and Aaron, who had been whispering excitedly to the journalists just moments before, froze completely. Their eyes widening in sudden visceral panic. Christopher's shock rapidly mutated into an explosive defensive rage. He slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table, the sound cracking like a whip. He pointed a shaking manicured finger at me, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch that completely destroyed his carefully crafted executive persona. He shouted, demanding to know how I had bypassed security and gotten up to the restricted executive floor. He screamed at the board members, telling them not to look at me loudly, proclaiming that I was just his delusional father who had completely lost his mind from grief. Desperate to maintain control in front of the flashing cameras outside the glass, Christopher turned toward the hallway and began bellowing for the security guards, ordering them to immediately drag the vagrant out of the building. 2 broad-shouldered security guards who had been standing near the elevators, rushed into the boardroom, their hands reaching out to grab my arms, just as they had done in the lobby the day before. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds stepped forward, his tailored suit catching the light. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice above a calm, conversational volume, but his words carried the crushing weight of absolute legal supremacy. He raised a single hand pointing an authoritative finger directly at the two security guards. He calmly informed them that if they laid a single finger on my suit, they would be immediately terminated, stripped of their pensions, and personally sued for physically assaulting the sole legal owner of the building they were currently standing in. The security guards froze completely, their hands hovering inches from my arms. They looked at Christopher, then back at Mr. Reynolds, recognizing the undeniable tone of a man who held the true keys to their livelihood. Slowly, wisely, they took 3 large steps backward and lowered their hands, lowering their heads in submissive silence. Christopher's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He leaned across the table, his veins bulging in his neck, screaming that Mr. Reynolds was out of his mind. He yelled that he was the chief executive officer, that the will had cleared probate, and that he owned the entire $30 million empire. He commanded the board members to ignore the intrusion and sign the golden parachute documents immediately, frantically, trying to secure his stolen millions before the illusion collapsed. Mr. Reynolds did not argue with the hysterical boy. He simply walked with measured, deliberate steps right up to the center of the massive mahogany table. The board members instinctively pulled their chairs back, terrified of the man standing before them. Mr. Reynolds raised the heavy stack of crimson folders high in the air and let them drop. The thick legal files slammed into the polished wood with a thunderous, resonant boom that shook the water glasses and echoed off the high ceilings. The sound was so violent and final that Melissa actually let out a small, terrified scream. Mr. Reynolds looked around the table, his sharp gray eyes locking onto every single hand-picked sycophant Christopher had brought into the room. He informed the board in a voice dripping with legal venom that the papers they were currently hovering over were entirely fraudulent. He stated clearly that Christopher and Melissa Wallace did not own the company, did not own the patents, and did not hold the deed to the glass tower they were sitting in. He announced to the breathless room that the operational shell they managed was currently in catastrophic default, owing an immediate $15 million in back rent and licensing fees to the overarching parent trust. He tapped the crimson folders on the table and declared that the sole absolute dictator of that parent trust was standing right behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the silence of a massive ship hitting an iceberg in the dead of night. The board members slowly, carefully placed their heavy gold pens back onto the table, sliding the golden parachute contracts far away from their hands. The journalists, pressing their faces against the glass walls, were frantically taking notes, their eyes wide with disbelief as they realized they were witnessing the greatest corporate execution of the decade. Christopher stared at the red folders, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He looked at me, his arrogant facade entirely stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified, confused child. He stammered, asking what kind of sick joke I was playing, insisting that his mother had left me nothing but a dusty, empty envelope. I finally stepped forward, walking slowly past the trembling board members until I was standing directly across the table from my son. I looked into his panicked eyes and let a lifetime of quiet observation flow into my voice. I spoke evenly, ensuring that every single person in the room, including the reporters outside the glass, heard my words clearly. I told him that his mother did not leave me an empty envelope. I told him she left me the keys to the kingdom because she knew exactly what he would try to do the moment her heart stopped beating. I watched his eyes dart around the room, desperately looking for an exit, for a loophole, for a way to assert the dominance he had faked for so long. I leaned slightly over the table, resting my hands on the cool wood, mirroring his earlier posture, but backing it with legitimate, devastating power. I looked at the golden parachute contracts scattered across the table, and then looked back at my son. I told him in a voice as cold as winter ice that I was not here to beg for a $1,000 allowance. I told him I was the landlord, and I had come to collect the rent. The silence in the grand boardroom was so absolute that I could hear the erratic, frantic breathing of my children. Christopher was gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white as his mind struggled to process the devastating reality of my words. He looked at the heavy crimson folders resting on the polished wood as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. The invited journalists pressing their faces against the glass walls of the room were frantically typing on their phones and snapping photographs documenting every second of this spectacular corporate collapse. Mr. Reynolds did not give my son a single moment to recover his composure. The seasoned corporate attorney stepped forward and opened the first crimson folder. The sound of the thick paper turning echoed like a gavel striking a block. Mr. Reynolds began to read the legal reality in a cold, methodical voice that left absolutely no room for interpretation or debate. He announced to the room that the operational shell currently managed by Christopher and Melissa Wallace was entirely legally dependent on the overarching parent trust. He explained that every single proprietary software system the company used to track global shipments, every manufacturing patent, and the very logo currently glowing on the top of the building were exclusively owned by my holding company. He turned to the next page and stated that the operational shell had been operating under a strict licensing agreement for the past 20 years. Mr. Reynolds looked directly at the trembling board members and clarified the exact financial terms. He told them that Barbara had routinely forgiven the massive quarterly licensing fees on the back end, simply to keep the operational shell highly profitable on paper. However, he noted with a chilling calm that upon her death, the grace period immediately terminated. The parent trust was now legally obligated to collect all outstanding debts. He pulled out a copy of the plain white envelope, the very same notice of default that Christopher had carelessly tossed into his office wastebasket 3 days prior. Mr. Reynolds informed the breathless room that because the current chief executive officer had actively ignored a formal legal demand, the operational shell was now in catastrophic breach of contract. He stated the final number clearly, ensuring the journalists outside could read his lips. The company owed the parent trust an immediate non-negotiable sum of $15 million for unpaid licensing fees and retroactive property rent. Furthermore, he explained that until the debt was fully settled, the operational shell was legally forbidden from accessing any of the patented software, effectively halting all global business operations by midnight. Melissa let out a desperate choking sound. She grabbed the edge of the table, her pristine designer dress suddenly looking entirely out of place on a woman facing total financial ruin. She looked at Aaron, her husband, whose face had drained of all color. The massive personal loans they had taken out, the luxury yachts, the designer clothes were all financed by a company that was essentially bankrupt and $15 million in the hole. Christopher finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He slammed both hands flat onto the table, his chest heaving. He shouted that it was a lie, a massive, elaborate fabrication. He pointed his shaking finger at me and screamed to the room that I was nothing but a dirt-covered gardener. He yelled that his mother had built the $30 million empire entirely from scratch with her own bare hands and her own brilliant mind. He insisted that I was just a pathetic old man trying to steal a legacy I had absolutely no part in creating. I stood perfectly still, letting his hysterical insults wash over me. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, looking between the screaming, arrogant son and the perfectly calm, impeccably dressed father. They were beginning to realize who truly held the power in the room. I stepped closer to the table, silencing Christopher, simply by raising my hand. I looked deeply into his panicked eyes and told him it was time he finally learned the true history of the empire he was currently trying to destroy. I spoke in a slow, steady voice that carried the weight of 40 years of buried secrets. I told my children that 40 years ago, long before the private jets and the towering glass skyscrapers, their mother was sitting at a kitchen table crying over a mountain of foreclosure notices. I explained that her family business, the original logistics company she had inherited from her father, was drowning in massive toxic debt. They were weeks away from total bankruptcy, facing the loss of their homes and their livelihoods. I paused, letting the reality of my words sink into the quiet room. I told them that at that exact same time, I was running my own highly successful shipping firm. I had built it from nothing, working 18-hour shifts, sweating on loading docks and negotiating contracts until my voice gave out. I was wealthy, stable, and completely independent. But I loved their mother with a depth they could not possibly comprehend. I watched Melissa's eyes widen as the truth began to dismantle the false narrative she had believed her entire life. I told them that I made a choice 40 years ago. I liquidated my entire company. I sold my trucks, my warehouses, and every single asset I had built to generate a massive influx of pure cash. I took every dime of my own hard-earned fortune, and I poured it directly into Barbara's failing business to save her from ruin. I explained that my money was the absolute bedrock upon which their entire shiny empire was built. I provided the capital that stabilized the ledgers and funded the global expansion. But I knew Barbara had a brilliant mind for public relations and corporate strategy. She thrived in the spotlight, while I preferred the quiet peace of the background. So I legally structured the parent trust to protect my initial massive investment, but I stepped aside operationally. I let her take the title of Chief Executive Officer. I let her pose for the business magazines and accept the awards because her happiness was the only return on investment I ever cared about. Christopher stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The narrative he had used to justify his cruel arrogance, that he was the brilliant heir to a self-made corporate queen, and that I was just a lucky bystander, was entirely obliterated. I stepped even closer to the table, my voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper. I told him that his mother never viewed me as a shadow. She viewed me as her absolute equal, her savior, and her partner. And as her health began to fail, she saw exactly what her children were becoming. She saw the greed twisting their hearts, the lavish, careless spending, the arrogant way they looked down on working people. She knew that the moment she died, they would attempt to bleed the operational shell dry to fund their vanity. I told the silent room that Barbara did not leave me an empty envelope out of disrespect. She left me that envelope as a final brutal test for her children. If they had shown me a single ounce of compassion, if they had allowed me to grieve in the home I built and treated me as their father, I would have naturally opened the trust and shared the true wealth with them. We would have managed the transition together as a family, but they could not even wait 48 hours before handing me an eviction notice. They could not wait to freeze my meager personal checking accounts, to force me to beg for a humiliating allowance. I looked at Melissa, who was now openly weeping her hands, covering her face in absolute shame. I looked at Christopher, who was trembling as his entire false identity was stripped away in front of his hand-picked board members and the flashing cameras of the press. I told them that they had failed their mother's final test in the most spectacular and cruel way imaginable. They took the shiny objects she left as bait, and they cast aside the man who actually owned the kingdom. I reminded them that they had publicly humiliated me in the lobby of my own building just 24 hours ago, telling me to go dig ditches if I wanted to eat. I slowly turned to the terrified board members who were completely paralyzed in their chairs. I had advised them very clearly that if they signed the golden parachute contracts currently resting on the table, they would be legally complicit in a massive, active corporate fraud. I informed them that the forensic auditors down the hall had already secured the digital records of Christopher and Melissa, attempting to illegally sell corporate assets and shred financial documents to cover their personal debts. The board members did not hesitate for a single second. One by one, they grabbed the unsigned golden parachute contracts and shoved them back toward the center of the table, pushing away from Christopher and Melissa, as if they were suddenly contagious. The wealthy socialites and sycophants Christopher had relied upon to rubber stamp his theft were now abandoning him instantly, desperately trying to distance themselves from the catastrophic legal fallout. Rachel and Aaron, realizing that the entire empire was effectively dead and that they were personally implicated in the massive missing funds, began to slowly back away from the table. The loyalty they feigned was entirely conditional on the flow of endless cash. Now that the money was gone, their self-preservation instincts completely overrode their marital vows. I stood at the head of the boardroom table, flanked by the brilliant attorney and the relentless auditors. I looked at my children, stripped of their power, their wealth, and their false pride. The empire they thought they conquered was nothing but a fragile house of cards, and I had just confidently, calmly pulled out the foundation. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I simply embodied the cold, hard, unyielding reality of the consequences they had brought upon themselves. The silence that followed my declaration hung over the boardroom like a suffocating weight. The board members had physically distanced themselves from the table, terrified of being caught in the blast radius of this corporate explosion. But Melissa refused to surrender to the reality crashing down around her. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. She spun around to face her husband, her voice cracking as she ordered him to get their senior litigation team on the phone immediately. She screamed that they were going to file an emergency injunction, that they would drag me into court and prove I was a delusional old man forging documents to steal their rightful inheritance. She paced behind the leather chairs, waving her hands wildly, demanding that Aaron fix the situation right that very second. But Aaron did not reach for his phone. He did not mirror his wife's aggressive fury. Instead, he was standing frozen near the back of the room, staring blankly at the polished floor. A terrifying thought had just pierced through his rising panic. He slowly reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of documents they had signed in that windowless basement the day before. The contracts from the Shadow Investment Syndicate. The ones they had frantically signed to secure the 30 cents on the dollar cash buyout to cover their massive personal debts. He flipped past the signature pages, his eyes darting across the dense legal addendums they had completely ignored in their rush for salvation. As Aaron read the fine print, the last remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His hands began to shake so violently that the thick paper audibly rattled in the quiet room. He backed away from Melissa as if she were suddenly contagious. He was not looking at a standard real estate transfer. He was looking at the lethal poison pill Mr. Reynolds had buried deep within the text. Melissa stopped pacing. She looked at her husband, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper as she asked him what was wrong. Aaron could barely form the words. He looked up, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror, and stammered that they were going to federal prison. Christopher whipped around, demanding to know what Aaron was talking about, insisting that the shadow sale was completely separate from this current disaster. Aaron slammed the documents down onto the nearest surface, his voice finally breaking into a hysterical shout. He read the clauses out loud, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. He revealed that the contract explicitly stated the sellers acknowledged the superior legal claim of the parent trust over the operational shell. He read the section where they legally admitted to bypassing standard board approval to liquidate corporate assets for the sole purpose of covering personal private liabilities. He looked Christopher dead in the eye and shouted that they had not just signed a sales agreement. They had signed a legally binding confession to gross financial mismanagement, corporate embezzlement, and deliberate fraud, all under penalty of perjury. Furthermore, he read the final devastating clause. By signing the document, they had explicitly waived any and all rights to severance packages, retention funds, or golden parachutes. The air was completely sucked out of the room. Christopher staggered backward, physically collapsing into one of the heavy leather chairs. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The shadow investor was not a desperate lifeline. It was a trap set by my legal team, and he had walked right into it, eagerly signing away his freedom for a handful of cash that was never going to arrive. He had handed me the absolute, undeniable proof of his own criminal actions. The fragile alliance of greed that had held the four of them together instantly shattered. Rachel, who had been standing near the glass walls paralyzed by the unfolding disaster, suddenly sprang to life. Her survival instinct overrode any lingering shred of familial loyalty. She had married Christopher for his seemingly endless wealth and corporate prestige, not to spend the best years of her life visiting him in a federal penitentiary. She took a massive step away from her husband, pointing a shaking, accusing finger directly at him. She screamed that she had absolutely no knowledge of any embezzlement. She loudly proclaimed to the silent board members and the watching journalists outside that Christopher had lied to her about the company's financial health, that he had hidden the debts, and that she was completely innocent of any corporate fraud. Aaron immediately followed her lead, throwing his own wife directly under the bus to save his own skin. He turned on Melissa and Christopher, his voice dripping with venom and desperate self-preservation. He shouted that he was merely following the directives of the chief executive officer. He lied seamlessly, claiming that Christopher had ordered him to find the shadow buyer, and that he had been coerced into participating in the illegal liquidation under the threat of losing his position in the family. He declared that he was just a victim of their toxic corporate manipulation. Melissa let out a gut-wrenching wail of absolute betrayal. She lunged toward Aaron, beating her fists against his chest, screaming that he was a coward and a liar. She sobbed that the massive real estate debts were his fault, that he had driven them into this desperate corner in the first place. Aaron shoved her away, his face twisted in disgust, telling her that she was completely delusional and that he was leaving her before she dragged him down into a prison cell. Christopher sat slumped in the heavy leather chair, watching his marriage disintegrate and his sister attack her own husband. The magnificent empire he thought he ruled had been reduced to a pathetic, vicious brawl among thieves. He had no lawyers to call. He had no golden parachutes to secure. He had no loyal allies left to defend him. He looked up at me, his eyes red and brimming with tears of total, absolute defeat. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly still, simply watching the implosion. I did not need to raise my voice or offer any further condemnation. Their own blinding greed had built the trap, and their own ruthless selfishness was now springing it shut. They had turned on each other the very second the money evaporated, proving exactly what their loyalty was truly worth. The financial checkmate was absolutely flawless, leaving them with nothing but the devastating consequences of their own actions. The boardroom emptied with the frantic speed of a sinking ship. The wealthy board members Christopher had gathered fled through the glass doors, refusing to make eye contact with the man who had invited them. Rachel and Aaron were already in the hallway, loudly arguing over who would contact a divorce attorney first. Inside the grand boardroom only, my two children remained trapped in the wreckage of their own devastating hubris. Christopher was slumped in the heavy leather chair, his face buried in his hands, while Melissa stared at the blank wall, her pristine designer dress looking entirely out of place in the room she no longer commanded. I did not feel the sudden rush of vindictive joy that a lesser man might have anticipated. I felt the profound, heavy silence of a father who had been forced to surgically remove a tumor from his own family tree. I turned to Mr. Reynolds, who stood perfectly still beside me, the quiet executioner of corporate law. I gave him a single subtle nod. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and withdrew a single sheet of crisp white paper. He placed it carefully on the polished mahogany table directly in front of Christopher. Christopher slowly raised his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the document. He did not want to read it, but the absolute silence in the room compelled him to look. It was a formal legal eviction notice. It explicitly mandated that Christopher and Melissa Wallace, along with any of their personal associates, had exactly 24 hours to permanently vacate the corporate premises. They were to be escorted by security to gather their personal belongings and hand over all access keys, digital tokens, and corporate devices. Melissa let out a hollow, broken laugh that sounded more like a dry sob. She whispered that 24 hours was impossible and stated that I was throwing them out onto the street with absolutely nothing. I looked down at my daughter, the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young woman whose lavish wedding I had secretly financed when her trust fund had temporarily dipped. I felt a sharp pang of memory, recalling the day I stood in my beloved greenhouse watering Barbara's orchids, while Melissa and her husband callously handed me a 30-day eviction notice from my own home. They had demanded I leave by the weekend because my gardening boots were ruining their aesthetic. I told Melissa that I was originally going to give them the standard 30 days. I explained that 30 days was the legal minimum and the polite societal standard. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the table, leaning my weight on my hands, just as Christopher had done to his subordinates. I lowered my voice, ensuring the cold, unyielding truth penetrated their panicked minds. I told them that I changed my mind because I remembered the exact cold tone they used when they ordered me out of the family estate less than 48 hours after their mother was put into the ground. I reminded them that they had not given me 30 days. They had demanded I leave immediately because my presence complicated their real estate flipping timeline. Christopher stared at the eviction notice, his hands trembling as he traced the raised seal of the parent trust at the bottom of the page. He looked up at me, his voice cracking as he asked where they were supposed to go. He pleaded that their credit lines were entirely frozen, that the banks had locked their personal accounts, and that Rachel and Aaron had completely abandoned them. He begged me, stating that they had no cash, no homes, and no friends left in the city. He asked me how they were supposed to survive the night. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke suit. I told my son that when he kicked me out of the family estate, he did not ask where I would sleep. I reminded him that when he froze my checking accounts and laughed at me in the lobby of this very building, he specifically told me to go dig ditches if I wanted to eat. I explained that true survival is not inherited, it is earned. I told him that 40 years ago, when his mother and I were staring down absolute bankruptcy, we did not beg our parents for an unearned bailout. We sold everything we owned. We lived in a cramped studio apartment, and we worked 18-hour shifts until our hands bled to build the foundation of the empire they had just tried to steal. Mr. Reynolds stepped forward, signaling the end of the conversation. He informed Christopher and Melissa that corporate security was currently waiting outside the boardroom doors. He explained that they would be permitted to take only their personal items. Any attempt to remove corporate documents, digital files, or company hardware would result in immediate federal theft charges, adding to their already catastrophic legal liabilities. He noted that the luxury company cars they drove to the office had already been repossessed by the fleet management team under his direct orders. Christopher stood up on shaky legs, attempting to grab the sleek silver company laptop resting on the table. Mr. Reynolds reached out and placed a firm, heavy hand entirely over the device. He calmly reminded my son that the computer belonged exclusively to the parent trust and that trying to walk out with it would guarantee a police escort rather than a private security detail. Christopher let go of the machine as if it burned him, his shoulders completely collapsing under the weight of his absolute ruin. I turned my back on my children, walking toward the heavy mahogany doors. Melissa called out my name one final time, her voice cracking with a desperate, agonizing plea for the father she had thrown away. I paused at the threshold, but I did not turn around to look at her. I spoke to the polished wooden doors, ensuring my final words echoed perfectly in the grand, empty room. I told them to leave their corporate keys on the reception console on their way out, just as they had demanded I do at the estate. I walked out into the bright, bustling hallway, leaving the heavy doors open behind me. The security guards, who had once been ordered to throw me out onto the street, were now standing at absolute attention, ready to escort my fraudulent heirs out of the glass tower. The silence they left behind was not an empty void. It was the solid, undeniable foundation of a legacy finally cleansed of its most toxic elements, entirely secured and quietly reclaimed by the man who built it. The days that followed their eviction from the glass tower were a masterclass in financial gravity. Christopher and Melissa had spent months signing their names to mountains of debt believing the corporate shell would shield them from personal ruin. They had completely forgotten the ironclad personal guarantees they hastily signed in boardrooms and yacht clubs. When the parent trust officially cut ties with their hollow shell, the massive banking institutions holding their debt did not hesitate for a single second. The banks moved with a cold, mechanical ruthlessness that made my legal maneuvers look gentle. The financial institutions had armies of lawyers whose sole purpose was to reclaim capital from failing debtors, and my children had just become their primary targets. Every signature they had carelessly scribbled on loan applications was now a binding contract demanding immediate repayment. It began on a crisp Tuesday morning outside Christopher's sprawling suburban estate. A fleet of heavy tow trucks arrived unannounced, blocking his manicured driveway. Christopher stood on his front porch in a wrinkled bathrobe, watching in absolute horror as the repo men hitched up his imported sports cars. He tried to argue with the recovery agents, waving his arms and demanding they call his wealth manager. The men simply handed him a thick stack of court orders and continued tightening the steel chains. His credit score had completely evaporated overnight, and his lenders were aggressively reclaiming every physical asset to cover the massive unsecured loans he had taken against the corporate headquarters. Rachel stood inside the grand foyer, watching the repossession through the tall bay windows. The illusion of her endless wealth had shattered, and her survival instinct instantly overrode her marriage vows. She did not walk outside to comfort her husband in his darkest moment. Instead, she calmly walked upstairs to the master suite and began stuffing her most expensive designer handbags and remaining jewelry into matching luggage. When Christopher finally walked back inside, completely defeated, he found his wife standing by the front door with her bags packed. Rachel did not offer tears or apologies. She simply handed him a manila folder containing expedited divorce papers and coldly stated she was not going to spend her youth drowning in federal bankruptcy court. She walked out the door, stepped into a waiting taxi, and completely erased him from her life without looking back a single time. Christopher was left standing alone in the massive empty hallway, surrounded by bare walls, realizing that the love he thought he had purchased was entirely conditional on the balance of his bank account. Across town, Melissa was experiencing her own catastrophic dismantling. She had driven to the hoping to find some solace on the massive luxury yacht she had purchased just days prior. When she arrived on the wooden docks, she found a heavy steel padlock on the gate and a team of maritime repo agents standing on the teak deck. The staggering 7-figure down payment had completely bounced, and the leasing agency was seizing the vessel for immediate breach of contract. Melissa fell to her knees on the wooden planks, sobbing uncontrollably as the beautiful ship was slowly towed away from the dock. She pulled out her phone and frantically dialed her husband, begging him to fix the disaster. Aaron did not answer her calls. He was sitting in a cramped lawyer's office, desperately trying to sever his legal ties to the Wallace family. He knew the massive speculative real estate loans he had taken out were now entirely unsupported. If he remained legally bound to Melissa, the banks would strip him of his remaining personal assets to cover her fraudulent corporate debts. When Melissa finally tracked him down at their rented luxury penthouse, she found him standing in the empty living room, holding his own set of divorce papers. Aaron looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. He told her she was a massive liability and that he was filing for an immediate dissolution of the marriage to insulate himself from the federal fraud charges she was facing. He walked out, leaving her sitting alone on the floor of an apartment they were about to be evicted from. Melissa wept bitterly, realizing that the man she had conspired with to steal my home was now treating her with the exact same ruthless cruelty they had shown me. The social exile was absolute and devastating. Christopher and Melissa had built their entire social circles on the foundation of unearned wealth and lavish parties. When the money vanished, their friends evaporated into thin air. Christopher tried to call his wealthy country club associates, begging for temporary loans or a place to stay. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Melissa tried to reach out to the socialites she had showered with expensive gifts, but her numbers were universally blocked. They were entirely excommunicated from the elite world they thought they ruled. Within a single week, my 2 children found themselves standing on the cold concrete streets of the city with absolutely nothing to their names. Their spouses had legally abandoned them, taking whatever liquid cash remained in their joint accounts. Their properties were locked under heavy bank foreclosures, and their credit lines were permanently destroyed. They were forced to pack their few remaining clothes into cheap plastic bags, entirely stripped of the arrogance that had defined them. They had believed they were untouchable titans of industry, but the crushing weight of their own debt proved they were nothing more than foolish children playing a very dangerous game. They had traded their loving family for the pursuit of endless greed, and now they were left shivering in the devastating reality of total, absolute ruin. The heavy wrought iron gates of the family estate stood perfectly still against the backdrop of a cold, gray morning. These were the same gates through which I had walked just a few weeks ago, dragging a single leather suitcase, believing I had lost everything. Now I stood on the inside, the undisputed master of the legacy my wife and I had built, watching my 2 children shivering on the outside. Christopher and Melissa looked entirely unrecognizable. The bespoke Italian suits and designer dresses were gone, replaced by wrinkled, ill-fitting clothes they had likely salvaged from discount bins. Their faces were drawn, hollowed out by the agonizing stress of total financial ruin and public humiliation. They looked like lost, terrified children, but I knew the darkness that lived behind their desperate eyes. They had been standing at the gate for 20 minutes, buzzing the intercom repeatedly. I finally walked down the long, winding driveway, my footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air. I did not open the gate. I stood behind the cold irons, looking at the strangers I had once raised with so much unconditional love. Christopher stepped forward, wrapping his hands around the black metal, his knuckles turning white. His voice broke as he spoke, begging me to let them in. He cried that they had absolutely nothing left, that Rachel and Aaron had completely abandoned them, and that the banks had seized their very last penny. He sobbed, saying they had been sleeping in a cheap roadside motel and that they were hungry and terrified. Melissa pushed her way to the front, her face streaked with old tears. She pressed her face against the iron bars, pleading with me. She reminded me that I was their father, that they were my flesh and blood. She begged me for forgiveness, claiming they had made a terrible mistake because they were young and blinded by greed. Then she asked the question that sealed their fate. She asked if they could just have the $1,000 allowance they had offered me at the reading of the will. She promised they would take the money and disappear, that they would never bother me again if I just gave them enough to survive the week. I looked at my daughter, remembering the day she stood in my greenhouse demanding I pack my bags so she could flip my home for a quick profit. I looked at my son, remembering the day he laughed at me in the lobby of his glass tower, telling me to go dig ditches if I wanted to eat. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt a profound, absolute emptiness where my love for them used to reside. I spoke softly, ensuring my voice carried clearly through the iron bars. I told them that when they offered me that $1,000, they did not offer it out of love or compassion. They offered it as a humiliating bribe to erase me from their lives so they could steal the empire Barbara and I had bled to build. I reminded them that true survival is not an inherited right. It is something that must be earned through sweat, honesty, and relentless hard work. I told them that if I gave them money now, I would only be feeding the greedy, entitled parasites they had chosen to become. I took a slow, deliberate step backward away from the gate. I told my children that 40 years ago, their mother and I started with absolutely nothing but our own 2 hands and an unbreakable trust in one another. I told them that it was time they learned how to build a life from the ground up, just as we did. I turned my back on them, ignoring their desperate, agonizing screams and the sound of them shaking the heavy iron gates. I walked back up the long driveway toward the massive quiet house, leaving them to face the devastating, absolute reality of the consequences they had ruthlessly engineered for themselves. The truth is, my friends, that family is not defined merely by the blood running through your veins. It is forged through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and a love that does not demand a financial return. We often blind ourselves to the cruelty of our relatives out of a misplaced sense of duty, allowing them to exploit our kindness until there is nothing left. I learned the hardest way possible that setting absolute boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Sometimes you have to walk away from the people you love to save yourself from the monsters they have chosen to become. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing your own experiences with setting difficult boundaries.